May we please settle down so that we can start? You could please close the doors. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this public hearing. And this is the hearing for the 3 applications filed by ESCOM with Nersa for the regulatory clearing account in terms of the MYPD3 that was approved by Nersa. The years for the regulatory clearing account is for 2014-15. 2015-16 and 2016-17. Those are the 3 applications before us, which brought us here today to hear the views of stakeholders that are going to present facts and evidence before the energy regulator in order to assist the energy regulator to arrive at the right decision. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Nomfundo Maseti, and I'm the full-time regulator member, primarily responsible for gas as well as electricity at Nersa. With me today, I'm assisted by the members of the energy regulator. I'll introduce them to you. Starting from my left, I have Mr. Musuvuki Lemkize, who is the full-time regulator member at Nersa, primarily responsible for petroleum pipeline, as well as the member of the electricity subcommittee. On my right, I have Mr. Yusuf Adam, who is the part-time regulator member at Nersa and the member of the petroleum pipelines. Ladies and gentlemen, the hearing that we are having today is governed by the Nersa rules for public hearings, and this hearing was duly advertised in various newspapers, including Sunday Times and Business Day, as well as Sowetan and in the Government Gazette. It was also announced in the various radio stations, community radio stations and provincial radio stations. It is also published in our website as well as in our social media accounts, Facebook and Twitter. Ladies and gentlemen, in terms of the rules that govern this hearing, is that all presenters will be required to do their presentations under oath, and the presenters are given 20 minutes to do their presentation, with the exception of the applicant who has brought at least 3 applications, who will be given approximately 40 minutes to do the presentation. And ladies and gentlemen, please note that only the members of the panel may ask questions to all the presenters. However, if there is a member of the public amongst us today who has a question to ask or who would require clarity, you are free to do so. Write your question down on a piece of paper and give your piece of paper to Miss Edith, who is sitting right here on my left-hand side, who will then bring that piece of paper to the panel so that we can decide how we can ask that question. Should the presenters identify certain information that they consider to be confidential, please inform the chairperson about the information that you consider to be confidential, so that we can decide how we deal with that information and whether or not we would like to clear the room so that we can hear that confidential information. In terms of the recording of these proceedings, they are recorded by the microphones as well as the live streaming, and the recording will be the official record of these the public hearings, which will take into consideration when we make the final decision at Nersa. May I request that you switch off your cell phones, please, so that they do not interrupt the proceedings. If you cannot switch it off, please put it on silent to make sure that it doesn't disturb the presenters when they are presenting. At this point in time, I would like to invite the person who's going to inform us about the evacuation procedures. If there's anyone who will inform us. All right, you may proceed, sir.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Nersa, representing the hotel. I'm the health and safety rep. Few house rules. Bathrooms are on your, if you exit through the door, the first door to your right hand side are the gents, and the second door to your right are the ladies. But with the number of people that we have extra bathrooms inside the hotel. You can just go through the restaurant and they will assist you. But they are just close by to the restaurant. Upon activation of the fire alarm, we have 2 exit doors as we need immediate evacuation of the building. The people sitting at the back can evacuate through the door there. There is a sign, please do not run, just walk slowly out. Just follow the signs, and the people sitting at the front can exit through this door here. Our assembly point is in the parking lot, just on the when you go out on the right hand side. If by any chance you are in the building as well, just follow the signs. Our staff members who are fire marshals or health and safety reps will assist you to point to the assembly point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for the briefing on the evacuation procedures. Ladies and gentlemen, in terms of our program today, we have Eskom as the applicant who is going to present first, and I would like to then invite Eskom to come forward to give us the presentation. I'm going to request our sister here, who's the interpreter, if you could shift a bit before. I don't know, maybe the sitting is not properly arranged because you can't sit right in front. May you please raise your right hand, and do you solemnly declare that the facts and the evidence you're going to provide to this panel today is the truth and the whole truth?
I do, Chairperson.
All right, please state your name and your designation at Eskom for the record.
My name is Caleb Kessam. I'm currently the Acting Chief Financial Officer of Eskom.
All right, please proceed with your presentation, sir.
Thank you, Chairperson. Today's presentation, I'll focus on the overall summary of the 3 regulatory clearing account applications. But in today's session, Chairperson, will pay particular focus to the revenue variance and the implications around the volumes and how it's computed. And more importantly, one of the important items that was asked during this hearing is the impact in terms of energy conservation scheme that Eskom had requested customers during the course of MYPD3, and I'll get some of my colleagues to assist.
Mr. Kasim, as long as you're not going to leave out certain essential parts of the of the application for the benefit of stakeholders in Limpopo.
Yes, Chairperson, we'll cover all the elements. As a Chairperson, I said our regulatory clearing accounts is for the 3 years, years 2, 3, and 4 of MYPD3. And effectively, what the regulatory clearing account does, it compares the actual results that has occurred during the year and compares that to what was allowed during the decision of MYPD3. It then also takes into account the MYPD methodologies and the rules to deal with variances which do qualify to flow through in terms of the RCA application. Some items don't qualify, and then Eskom has, in these 3 applications, adopted that approach in submitting to the regulator. I think an important item to highlight, the RCAs is a backward-looking reconciliation between the actuals and the decisions. It's got nothing to do with forward-looking trajectories. That's a normal revenue application process. Chairperson, this is also It's got nothing, this RCAs does not link in any way to the recent decision of 5.23% in terms of the 2018-19 decision that was made in December. And I want to say this up front, and we've said this throughout the hearings. Obviously, the regulator assessing and making a decision on 3 RCAs, we are not expecting that when the decision is made and how it will flow through eventually to the tariffs will happen in a once-off adjustment. We expect them to be a phasing, and during the Gauteng closing we present our proposal in terms of the phasing of the RCAs. Chairperson, what we've done is, in terms of our approach, over and above the methodology, we've also utilized and embedded the principles that were included in the decision for the year 1 RCA of 2013-14, and those principles are then applied in terms of the 3 applications that sits before the regulator today. And effectively, some of the key ones to highlight is that from an allowed revenue perspective, we look at it at a company level. I think an important point here to highlight, it's based on what revenue is billed and not what is collected. So Eskom's challenge in terms of collecting some of the outstanding debt is not being requested in terms of these RCAs. We assume for RCA purposes whatever is billed and is collected, and then you compare the bill to the allowed revenue as part of the revenue variance. In terms of your gas turbines, what we've asked for in this application is any excess volume over and above what was allowed by the regulator is then rewarded or compensated at the equivalent of the average coal cost, not the actual gas turbine cost, which is far more expensive, that was incurred during this period, especially in the 2nd and the 3rd year of these RCAs, and you'll see that in a later slide. The 3rd point, Chairperson, is that international purchases, as was presented and included in the decision for 13-14, is treated as a cross-border IPP, and that principle was also applied in the 2018-19 decision of the 5.23. Chairperson, and then in terms of operating expenditure, the rule states that if there is an over expenditure on operating costs, which effectively covers staff costs, maintenance costs, and other costs like insurance, the methodology under MYPD3 does not allow Eskom to recover that, so it's not included in the application. However, we just highlight what that variance is, because it means that effectively Eskom has to absorb that variance in its bottom line over this period. This is a summary of what these RCAs have added up to. On average, it's about 22 billion rand per annum, and you will see that the big contributing factors, the main one being the revenue variance, which is linked to the difference between what the decision volumes were and what the actual volumes were, multiplied by the average price in terms of that variance. And that you will see there in the summary. It escalates from 8.8 billion in 14-15 to 15.6 in the 15-16 and 20 billion in 16-17, totaling 44 billion. So the point here is, of the 66 billion from the total of the 3 RCAs, 2/3 of that is linked to the volume variance. And then the other contributing elements are the second one being independent power producer costs, over the 3 years, adding up to 7.4 billion. The international purchases, as I said, it's a cross-border IPP comprising a total of 9.1 billion rand. And you will see that the coal cost variance that's claimed in terms of the methodology and the performance-based regulation mechanism included in the methodology, which shows 3.4 billion rand for coal costs, and in OCGTs over the period 1.4 billion rand. And then there's other components of primary energy totaling 2.8 billion, which we'll go into towards the end of the presentation. And what you will see there as well is, because of the much lower sales and therefore also production in this 3-year period compared to the decision, the environmental levy that was awarded and what has been incurred, that difference and under expenditure in terms of the amount linked to the 3.5 cents per kilowatt is then a refund or clawback in favor of the customer for 3.2 billion over the period. And then there's some other items which add up to 1.3 billion, totaling the total of 66.7 billion over the 3 years. Chairperson, in terms of the revenue variance, as I've said, we have taken the approach based on the principles and the methodology, and we've taken out any impact in terms of load shedding and curtailment. And the other question that was asked during the course of the hearings is, but what about the impact in terms of energy conservation scheme, and how much did that contribute in terms of the reduction or the difference in the sales volumes? And Chair, that's just a high-level summary. As I said, obviously the reduction in sales gets compounded over the period, and then the variances escalate as you get closer to the end of the cycle. The factors that drive the difference in volumes is a combination of the economic situation and environment that was encountered, lower investor confidence, customers decreasing their reliance on Eskom, commodity price changes, and there is an element of elasticity that is included in there. Throughout this period, on the positive side, the export sales, their volumes were slightly higher than what was assumed in the decision, which then helped to then contribute to reducing the net revenue variance over this period. And then, Chairperson, I think what I will do now, if you allow me, I'll ask my first colleague to deal with the revenue variance and how it's computed. There are important principles around how the variable cost and the fixed cost is interpreted and included in this RCA application. And thereafter, I'll ask the other colleague to deal specifically with the energy conservation part, and I'll come back to then deal with all the remaining elements as you requested, Chairperson. Thank you.
Mr. Yubek, may you please raise your right hand? May you please, do you solemnly declare that the facts you are going to present before this panel today is the truth and the whole truth?
I do, Chair.
Please state your name and your designation at ESCOM for the record.
Dion Miber, Corporate Specialist in Finance and Economic Regulation at ESCOM.
You may proceed with your presentation, sir.
Thank you, Chair.
You can just use the
What?
You use the controller.
Oh, that one.
Yeah.
Just pushing it on. Chair, what we'd like to just illustrate here, this is an issue that has come up in all of the sessions so far, the public hearing sessions, since the first one in Cape Town. And it seems there is generally difficulty with many stakeholders in understanding the functioning of the RCA mechanism and the regulatory methodology as it pertains to adjusting for the sales volume variance. So what we want to illustrate here is we're just using a very simple example, illustrative example to show how this works if there's a volume variance higher or lower than what was predicted. So in this example, we're assuming a value of 100 volumes that was assumed for purposes of the revenue determination, and a cost of variable cost of 30 and a fixed cost of 70, giving a total cost of 100. Now clearly if your total cost is 100 and you're anticipating to sell 100 units, then the price per unit will be 1. So it will be, and the price will consist of a recovery of variable cost of 30, call it cents if you want, and a recovery of the fixed cost of 70 cents. Now if things work out exactly as was assumed at the time of the revenue application, then there would be no adjustment, no variance, and no RCA. Now let's look at an example where the volume turned out to be 90. There's the 90. So immediately what will happen, automatically, in actual mode, assuming the only all other assumptions remain still valid, it's only the volume that changed. What will happen in actual mode is the variable cost, which responds to the volume, will also drop by 10%. That's a 10% movement, so the variable cost will drop by 10% from 30 to 27. The fixed cost will remain where it is, that's why it's called fixed cost. And the new adjusted total cost in actual mode that will be incurred will be 97. The problem is that the price that was determined at the beginning of the period on these assumptions will remain. The price cannot be adjusted during the year. So what now happens is at that price, this volume of the new volume of 90 will recover 90 times the 0.3 for the variable. It will recover a value of 27 in the revenue for variable cost, which is fine because it matches exactly the variable cost. But that volume of 90 multiplied by the 0.7 for the fixed cost will only recover 63. So if you add those two up, it gives you 90 total revenue, which is exactly right because it's 90 volume times the 1 price will give you, there's the 90 again on the revenue. Now that clearly leaves a problem because the actual fixed cost was 70 and what was recovered was 63. And that's where the RCA kicks in retrospectively to adjust for that 7 so that the original revenue plus the 7 would bring you back to the 97. And just to show how the RCA does it, how it does it is it firstly compares the assumed variable cost with the actual variable cost, is the 30 minus the 27, and the RCA will claw back the amount that was not spent on the variable cost. So it will claw it back from the utility, and on the other hand, the RCA will also compare the sales line. So it will say there was an assumption of 100, total of 100, and actual of 90, and it'll reflect that there. Oh, sorry, there's the 100, and there's the 90 total revenue that was collected, and it will reflect that 10 difference there, and that'll give you a net effect of the 7, which is exactly what you need in order to restore the thing to balance again. And so therefore, for this mechanism to operate, it's important that this adjustment there must be done at the full price. Because if it's only done at the value of the fixed cost, say the 70, then it will constitute a double counting of the clawback on the variable cost. And you can see there it works out exactly right. If foresight had been perfect, how would it have looked? One would have been able to forecast the 90 because your estimation would have been perfect and you would have known volume would be 90. So you would have known in advance that variable cost would not be 30 but 27. You would have known that the fixed cost would be 70. You would have known the total cost would be 97. And then you would have recalculated your fixed cost component per unit of sales. So you would have said the 70 cost divided by the 90 volume, 70 divided by 90, and you would have a fixed rate recovery, fixed cost recovery rate of 78, and you would have had a price of R1.08 or 1.08. And at that price, if you applied that price or that 78 recovery, that 78 recovery there, to the new volume, it means that you would have said 0.78 times 90 volume would have given you a fixed cost recovery of 70. You would have had the 27 variable, and that means had your foresight been perfect, you would have had a revenue in the actual mode of 97, which is where the RCA would have brought you to. So now in that case, the RCA will not have a necessity to make any adjustment because you'll already be at 97. So the RCA does not impose a burden on the consumer or benefit the utility. All it does is it merely restores the revenue to what it would have been had foresight been perfect. And in fact, what it does is it restores the fixed cost recovery, that fixed cost, to a full recovery, what it would have been had the foresight been perfect. So it also works if the volume was higher. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. It's the same principle. It just works in reverse. And then you can see if the volume was higher, you would have wound up with an over recovery of revenue. If your volume was 10 higher, you would have had a 10 over recovery of revenue. And then the RCA would have kicked in to adjust by 7. Why not by the full 10? Because obviously at the higher volume, you would have picked up a higher 10% higher variable cost. So the 100 should become 103. So again, the RCA does nothing else but to restore the fixed cost recovery, in this case in the favor of the consumer, to avoid a windfall gain to the utility by clawing back the full revenue gain, but by allowing an adjustment for the additional variable cost. And again, if there was perfect foresight, you would have got to exactly the same answer with your perfect foresight. You would just not would have had to make any adjustment through the RCA mechanism because your perfect foresight would have resulted in the 103 already. So, in summary, Chair, the purpose of the sales volume adjustment is merely to ensure that the fixed cost, as per the Nersa decision, is not under or over recovered. So the fact that as established with hindsight that large consumers, Eskom and Nersa, had in 2012 overestimated the electricity demand for the period up to March 2018 is not a matter of prudence, efficiency or reasonableness regarding the actual outturn, but it is at most a matter of inaccurate forecasting of a largely uncontrollable matter. Irrespective of whether such lower demand in this case was due to underestimating price elasticity, underestimating ECS impact, lower economic growth, commodity cycles, capacity constraint, whatever. It doesn't matter what the cause of it was merely a matter of not estimating those things accurately in 5-6 years in advance. And the correction of those initial overestimations do not form a punishment, a type of punishment of consumers, nor does it increase the overall cost to the consumers. It merely represents a deferred recovery of the fixed cost as per the original Nersa revenue determination. That fixed cost that would have already been recovered from the consumers in those initial years through a higher price had the demand estimates been accurate. And as mentioned, it works vice versa. The mechanism is symmetric, so it also works exactly the same way in the case that volume is higher. So the RCA mechanism that corrects for electricity demand over or underestimation is not a mechanism to restore sales volume to the estimated level. We picked up this misconception from many stakeholders over the last 3 weeks, but it's not that. It's not a mechanism to correct for to restore the sales volume to the originally estimated level, but it is a mechanism to correct for the under or over recovery of the fixed cost, which is caused by a variance between the estimated demand and actual demand. And it achieves that by adjusting the sales volumes, higher or lower, to align to what actually happened, and in effect then it recalculates what the price would have been on the actual volume to recover the fixed cost, and in the process it factors in, by clawing back on the variable cost, it factors in the reduced variable cost due to the lower volume, and the net effect of the clawback on the variable cost and the adjustment on the revenue leads to a net revenue adjustment through the RCA that is exactly equal to the amount of fixed cost that was not under recovered or over recovered. So, Chair, just to conclude, this mechanism is in line with both with international best practice of standard sound economic regulation, as well as with Nersa's own methodology, and specifically with regard to the RCA. What you saw in the example there is a reflection of exactly how the Nersa methodology functions.
Thank you, Mr. Ebert. Mr. Conrad, may you please raise your right hand? Do you solemnly declare that the evidence you're going to provide to this panel today is the truth and the whole truth?
I do.
May you please state your name for the record?
I'm Leon Conradi. I'm Senior Manager Electricity Pricing at ESCO.
Please proceed with your presentation.
Thank you, Chair. Again, just to take you through the discussions we had over the last couple of weeks. Just stating the MIPD methodology around adjusting for cost and revenue variances, where the total actual revenue differs from the total allowed revenue. And then the formulas there is already explained. But during the last couple of weeks, a lot of customers argued, and also Nersa requested information around the drop in sales because not due to economic reasons, but also other reasons. And we have discussed and debated various of them, and the first one, important one, was the one about load shedding. And for load shedding, we have presented this information, the next slide, at the previous, so I'm not going to go into the details, but the principle around that is we've identified the number of hours of load shedding, and we've multiplied it by the standard tariff for that specific year, allowed the decision for standard tariffs, and we got to those revenue amounts that we've deducted then from the total revenue, so that customers don't pay for load shedding. The second discussion was about the general reduction in sales due to various others, uncertainty, elasticity of supply, economic efficiency. Economic efficiency. The guys moved beyond what was requested because they see that they can save, and that then was also dealt with specifically in the variable cost that Dion Hubert has also now just explained, which you see transparently in the reduction in the coal volume, the cost of the coal volumes, which will Mr. Casson will later on also refer to. Then the last one where we also request of feedback, and that's the forecasted load as materials Eskom would anyway not have been able to supply them. And as a result of that, there was, and I'll take you through the background now, there was in the MIP methodology, there was a provision made for a power conservation program to deal with issues like that. And the methodology provided in 11.4 and 11.5. Now, it very clearly stipulates there that there will be a power conservation program, but it will be a mandatory once the frameworks have been put in place. And it will be done through a scheme. Specifically, the penalty scheme was called the safety net, or the ECS, that's the Energy Conservation Scheme. And what was said in the methodology is, in the absence of any electricity shortfall, the ECS shall be implemented on a voluntary basis. It also said the mandatory implementation will be implemented at no cost to Eskom with zero penalties until the promulgation of the EC policies. Because the point is, this scheme could not have been implemented officially until there was a proper regulatory framework. And at one stage there was public hearings held and the discussions took place, but eventually it never materialized. So during the MYPD3 period, it was only a voluntary scheme that placed. Maybe brief feedback. The white paper in 1998 already said the electricity demand will exceed supply in 2007. Now, the crisis in 2008 confirmed that extreme criticality of balancing the systems. And it was then also that would have persisted until much of the new baseload capacity from Medupi and Kusuri became available. So in the beginning of 2008, Eskom was requested to develop this whole program, and we've implemented a voluntary scheme. But subsequently then, an industry task unit was created by EIUG in March 2010 under the sponsorship of the DOE, with participation from Eskom and other stakeholders, developed this whole the whole scheme, the conservation scheme. And that team then concluded that after all demand and supply solutions have been implemented, there will still be a residual gap between supply and demand for the next 3 to 4 years. And they identified a number of strategies to mitigate those risks. And the energy conservation scheme was then the initial one. Now, because it's a voluntary scheme, let me rather, before I get to that, is just maybe the ECS, because the ECS at that stage was developed to be implemented as a mandatory scheme. And its three objectives was to improve management of South Africa's electricity system, the sustained reduction, and at that stage it was initially determined at 10%, but it allowed Nersa to change that number as it moves on. And then also promotion of energy efficiency growth, because at that stage the industries were very electricity intensive, and there was because the price of electricity was so low that there was no incentive for them to actually improve their electricity intensity. And I'll later on go through how it works. I just stipulate there for record the key elements there, but I will explain it later on in a slide that actually makes it easier. The rules around that stipulate, there's a whole long list of rules. It's a big document, but I think the essence out of it is the ECS customers participating shall be required to contribute in achieving the sales target by reducing their consumption by such an amount as may be determined by the regulator from time to time. As I said, that was part of the rules that has been put together by the STAR scheme. At the promulgation date, they would have started with the initial 10%. And then, very important, they said the allocation percentage applicable to the consumption increase be deemed to be 100%, and therefore no additional sales will be required in respect of the confirmed annual post reference. Only 10% is required from customers, or whatever that percentage was, but up to now it's only 10%. And then, therefore, the effective operation needed a very important customer reference consumption, which was then negotiated with customers. Now, when we implemented it, the voluntary scheme was implemented from July 2008 until January 2014. So it actually, the scheme itself was not implemented during the 3 years of the RCA. The official system stopped before that, but we continued with the request for 10% savings, and we agree with the Nersa that we requested customers to reduce the sales as we moved on. But I must also remember, not all customers were actually positive around it, because that said they will actually, if they have to do that, they're going to lose production. And they didn't want to be penalized for that, because it didn't make sense for them. So it was not that everybody agreed to it, it was on both sides. In January 2014, following a number of engagements, Eskom reached the point, because at that stage there was a first round of public hearings, and thereafter the implementation of the scheme that needed to be promulgated come to an end. And Eskom had to make it, because if we had to go on with it, we had to actually take out cost for the allocation management system, so that you can manage this whole system with customers as you want to expand it to as many customers as possible. And we had to make a decision, are we going to spend the money, which was quite costly, and we did not do it. So then ESCO made the decision, in the absence of direction from decision makers, not to continue with the mandatory scheme, but just to continue requesting customers to reduce 10%. It was not feasible to continue. There's no appetite from decision makers to enforce it. And also, a lot of the customers at that stage said, but they've already achieved the 10% savings. And they're not prepared to commit themselves to a further 10% saving as that. At that stage, in the preparation for this mandatory scheme, we had agreements with 131 customers, of which 95 were key industrial customers, and the consumption of these customers have been tracked. But what we also experienced during this time is that customer usage pattern, other than ECS targets, were also influenced by a number of other issues. And that is that rising electricity prices did play a role there. The strength of the commodity markets, there was the economic crisis since 2008, so markets for their products fell away. And then the introduction of energy efficient technologies, when they started with that, they realized they can actually save more, but which is to their benefit in the situation. And there you can see how the assumptions around the commodity prices, there were also a number of projects that have been put on hold because of this economic situation, because you could see what the assumptions were at that stage around the ferrochrome, aluminium, and platinum compared to what it eventually panned out. So there was a huge drop in the commodity prices that also forced a reduction in production from customers. Also the GDP growth assumption compared to what it actually did. And I just want to say it's not related to this, but that also driven the whole IRP 2010, because at that stage there was just this whole optimistic feeling because the growth was up, and government at that stage wanted us to achieve a 6% growth rate to work on the unemployment. The measured ECS savings, the official program initially said we will target customers using 25 gigawatt per annum, and to be expanded later on. But in the run-up, as already said, we had 131 contracted with, and then in terms of the issue rules, the customer allocation. So what we've done is we've actually checked the actual usage during the RCA periods, although the system was not in place, because you requested we must come up with a number. So our best approach in terms of what was to take what was the allocation during just January 2014, and then track the actuals of all 131 customers and compare that to what the allocation was. And again, I just want to say the variable component of that has already been taken into account by the coal volumes. It is the fixed cost. Although Eskom has actually spent that fixed cost, we have then on your request recalculated the fixed cost component of it, although we actually spent that money. And that's what I said, try to explain it. If you can see, the 10% line there, the red line, if that is your ECS target, the 10%, and we've tracked all 131 customers, and what we did here is then and said, because of the rule that said we want 10% and nothing beyond is required, they said up to 10%, that means in the green line. If customers have saved anything according to the green line of even up to the 10%, those amounts of gigawatt hours we've included in the calculations. When it was beyond the 10%, we said that was in terms of the rules not required, and also our interpretation of the rules not required, and it's also due to all the other commodity prices that dropped customers, the high-felt steels that closed down, the Bayside that closed down because of economic reasons, and ASA and a number of other customers who closed down. I think we've given that information already earlier on in previous presentations. So the number that you will see in the next slide is then all the savings between 0 and 10%, because customers have not saved the same. So you cannot take a blanket 10% saving, because that did not happen in reality. So if I can explain this calculation here and the importance of that, is I don't know which one you follow, maybe. Are you following that? So I can show you. that first column there, that one there, was the reference consumption for that year with these 131. With each individual customer, we have negotiated in the run-up to it a reference year compared to previous year's usage, because you had to have that reference years to where they were. Because remember, we wanted to measure the saving. The second column is then, and it's not a pure 10%, it is in each customer we've negotiated energy efficiency projects that were involved in there, but we also included the 10% saving. But that was also agreed with each customer of what they should target for from a savings perspective. So it's included. That is what they line, not that's not that. That is including. That is including the energy efficiency projects and what they want to do and how they're going to use. But that was negotiated with them. Then we had the actual consumption. But the actual consumption was for each one of those customers that we have contracts with. But as I already said, that you can't use that total savings because not all of it was as a result of the ECS. It's only up to 10%. So if you take the 10% savings, which is not 10% overall, but which is the savings per individual customers between 0 and 10%, and you add that, and all of them already, as I said, by the time that the RCA takes place, we're at their maximums. That's why it's all the same numbers. They have achieved that, and then we said, okay, what do we calculate it with? And then as per the calculation, we split the total average standard tariff price between a marginal cost, average marginal variable energy charge, and the fixed cost component. And this marginal component was by using the four most expensive coal stations, an average of their prices and IPPs, because that was the next, that was the savings that we could achieve through that. And then if you multiply that, then that number there in green there with the fixed cost component in this column here, you get to the value here, which is then in the order of 3.86. And G, that is our information that you require from that perspective.
If I may, just to reiterate what the slide is saying, what you can't do is take the 78,000 gigs and multiply it by 10%, because not every consumer, as Dion said, was gonna contribute to the ECS. And as Dion said, it's about up to 10% and below 10% that's included in the 3123. If the savings was beyond the 10%, like as Dion said, some customers actually fell off the volume because they shut down, etc. So you can't take that as a savings if they then shut down for other reasons during the MYPD period where the RCA is calculated. And then we just multiplied the 3,100 by the fixed cost. It's linked to the point that my colleague Mr. Bear was demonstrating. But I think the other important point here is this is the information in calculating as requested by Nersa. What does this mean? But it still goes back to the slide that Dion showed. We still incur that fixed cost, irrespective of whether ECS happened or not. And that's why, as our interpretation of the revenue rule in terms of the MYPD methodology, you apply the principles that Dion Yobea had demonstrated. If I move on to some of the other key items that contributes to the RCA, I spoke about international purchases in terms of what was the amounts incurred to what was assumed in the decision, and basically that is treated as a cross-border IPP pass-through. If you look at the other element in terms of the domestic IPPs, it's basically broken into two categories. I would link it to what I call the DOE programs of renewables and the DOE peakers, you will see that over the 3 years of the RCAs has a negative 400 million for renewables, and for DOE peaker a negative 1.2 billion. Then for the other components in terms of medium-term power purchase agreements, short-term power purchase agreements, the big one there is the STPPs, which was during the course of the MYPD period. Eskom did approach the regulator to allow for us to balance the supply and demand at that point in time to procure STPPs, which was far cheaper than the OCGT rates that were being incurred at that particular time. And similarly in terms of municipality projects and wholesale electricity pricing. That is the makeup of the IPP components. In terms of the coal burn variance that I disclosed earlier, the point I just want to highlight here is that there is the volume variance linked to the lower production. That's the variable cost that my colleagues highlighted in terms of the mechanism is then included as a clawback in favor of the consumer of 5.9 billion. However, there is a price element of 5.5 billion that is then claimed in terms of the mechanism of the actual cost versus what was the assumed rand per ton in the decision. And then there's, in terms of the performance-based regulation, that sharing mechanism between consumer and Eskom giving you the net impact in terms of the coal burn variance that's being claimed. OCGT's chairperson, as I said, we applied the principles that where Eskom exceeded the allowed volumes, we've then computed that excess volumes at the equivalent of an average coal cost per the principle in terms of the first year. So maybe if I just take an example in 15-16, you will see that firstly the volumes that was assumed in the decision was 540 gigawatts. We actually used OCGTs to the extent of 3,937 gigawatts. So from a cost perspective, Eskom incurred 8.690 billion rand in that year, compared to an allowed amount of 1.5 billion. And effectively, that difference between almost like 8.6 and the 1.5, that's about 7 billion. We're not claiming the full 7 billion in this RCA, that's 7.1. We're only claiming the equivalent of a coal cost, which is the 869, which means that Eskom for the year 15-16 on OCGT costs has absorbed 6.5 billion rand in that year, and similarly 4.9 billion in the 2014-15 year. However, when we got to 16-17, you will see, chairperson, that the usage in gigawatts was lower than what was assumed. We barely ran our OCGTs in that year, 29 gigs compared to 533. So the full difference in terms of the cost that was assumed and what was incurred, the 1.2 billion is then included as a refund as part of the RCA mechanism. Chairperson, this is some of the other items that contribute to what I call the other primary energy elements, and you will see it's a combination of items where if we spent less than what was assumed, it's given back, like on the water, 1.4 billion over the period, and similarly on fuel procurement and sorbent usage. There are, however, amounts like startup gas and oil of 2.2 billion and coal handling costs, which were much higher than what was assumed in the decision, and that's been included as part of the RCA submission over these 3 years. That's the environmental levy I spoke about. I don't want to go into much more detail on that. And chairperson, just to sum up the other amounts that make up the mechanism for completeness, includes a capital expenditure clearing account amount of 1 billion rand over the 3 years, EDSM where there's a refund of 517 million, service quality incentives relating to the performance on distribution and the networks compared to the mechanism and the methodology. That's in Eskom's favor of 897 million. And in terms of the mechanism, the operating costs, you're allowed to adjust for the difference between what was the average CPI assumption compared to the decision, and in that different rate movement is multiplied by the allowed OPEX that per the decision, which gives you a total over the period of 219 million. And then in terms of other income that we earned during the year, we use that to reduce the impact in terms of the RCA. So, Chairperson, I think in summary, you will see that obviously the big component that links to the 66 billion is the revenue variance, which we try to go in with more detail and also explain and demonstrate per your request how it came about and how we've calculated the ECS element of it. And then I've touched on more importantly the other big items being the IPPs, the cross-border in terms of international purchases. And then I think what you need to also understand throughout this period, because our operating costs exceeded the allowed amount, which we are not allowed to claim in terms of the rules, that was in excess of 33.8 billion, coupled with the 11.4 billion that Eskom has incurred on OCGTs. Those are the amounts that we had to then pay throughout this 3 years of the MYPD period. And as I said at the closing, Chairperson, we will then also present our proposal on the phasing and some of the other information that you have requested throughout these hearings. I thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kassim. If you could have a piece of paper and a pen, yes, with your colleagues, so that you can take down the questions from the members. Members, if you could ask questions of clarity from the presentation given by Eskom. If we can try and be concise in terms of the essence of the question that we want Eskom to ask. I'm going to start on my left-hand side with Mr. Mkhize.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, and thanks to the Eskom presenters for the updated presentation. Excuse me. The first question I would like to ask is, I know that you're talking of audited figures, financials. Just who does your audit? Who are your auditors? If you can help with that. And then you speak of water quality for the reason why the chemicals had to be used more. Is the question of more utilization of the chemicals, or is it a question of the higher prices for the chemicals? And if so, why this water suddenly becomes, the quality becomes a challenge? I'm asking this question because in an environment where there's been a lot of reports on corruption, who then would one would not have to take some figures on face value. And then I think from a point of view of assisting the public, it would help to present, I look at your slide 28, I think it would help to have Eskom clearly indicate the cost incurred so that it shows a kind of efficiency levels, because there are some costs that you have absorbed as Eskom. And that would say, if that was not the case, we'll be talking something different, if I can put it like that. So it helps to put the holistic picture, noting that you are a public entity, and then to assist also in what one of the presenters on Monday talked of making Eskom great again, because I think it will help in that process. And slide 22, I got a challenge. I just want to make sure that I understood you correctly there. The green line is the one that is below the 10%. And are you saying that that green line, because it was a saving that was initiated by your side, from your side, you are discounting it from the sales figures, or just clarify there? I just want to get further clarity. In other words, if the sales were and they say X amount, then that X amount it already includes these as if they were actually supplied. Just want to get that one clear. And then on also my understanding is that if you've got a tariff or price increase, right, you have a situation where the more the volumes, the less the price, because of the fixed cost being 70%. So it's 0.7 times that of the fixed cost, if in terms of the return, right? And therefore you would have an increase in the price with lower volumes. Right. Now, with coal, for example, you've got that question that you have not, still not adequately responded to, in terms of saying there is some handle that you have in terms of the coal price, and in the midst of the corruption that has been reported, I want to know as to how much of that do you think is fairly must be put at the door of ESCOM and not the consumer? Because what if people, through your procurement processes, you accepted suboptimal pricing for the company? All right. And then on slide 14 and 15, you talk of load shedding, right? But please help me here. Understand the issue of load shedding, that you would, at a particular demand, you would then not be able to supply, and you would shed the load. But the thing is that even if more was required, which was in terms of the forecast, you would not have met it in any event, right? So that you are able to then say, this is the actual capacity that we had. That the demand was not as foreseen shouldn't only be seen as something that should be against the consumer, because even if the consumer were to want more, the consumer would have even made your life more difficult in any event. So I'm trying to say that I see the cost on your side being actually even higher than the cost of load shedding, because of the actual capacity that you would have been able to fulfill. And I just for clarity, the export sales are not net; it's just they are on their own, and then the purchases, in other words, are not net, but they are on their own, and then the sales are included under the wholesale. Right. So now, remember there was a question of export sales price vis-a-vis domestic sales price. To say that, aren't we having a situation where the consumer, the domestic consumer, is actually, one would say, charge more than for export, and then no, I think I will stop at that, noting that we've already had lots of questions leading to this session today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mkhize. And Mr. Adam?
Thank you, Chairperson. I've got 3 or 4 themes around which I will ask my questions. And really all of it is to do with the fact that after almost 10 sessions, in my view, questions that have been put to ESCOM by presentations emerging from the public or from the engagements from the regulators, members, has really not provided the answers. And if you listen to the questions by my colleague now, Mr. Mkhize, I mean, those questions were not asked for the first time. So I feel, I'm going to start off with a practical suggestion, Chairperson, that ESCOM should make a list of all the questions that have been put to them from session 1 to date, and then present the answers or responses to those questions in that systematic manner. From that, you'll be able to see what you have in fact replied to and what is still missing, because there's several areas that have not been provided to, and we keep on being told it will come, it will come. So that will be a checklist as well. So that's a practical suggestion I'd like to start with, Chairperson. And that we should get at least the list of questions as well as the responses given today, because not new information, it's already there, but just to be presented in a different form, you know, as soon as possible, because I mean it's just putting together what it already is. I think that will benefit this process. The second point I'd like to make is that we've had regulator members and members of the public, organizations representing the interests of consumers, large scale consumers, or you know, individual small scale consumers, as well as households. And the plea from all of them have been the question of affordability and socio-economic impact. And all that we've heard from ESCOM is that they will at some point in future inform the regulator as to the timeline for the money that they would like from consumers. That they've not at all reflected on the economic situation in the country, the dire straits of poverty, or how any of the industries that are so severely impacted by the economic downturn are going to actually benefit from the request from ESCOM. They've not indicated that. And I dare say, although I cannot predict the decision of the regulator, that one of the key factors the regulator will take into account is not legitimacy, but affordability. And if we do not have sufficient data on affordability and socio-economic negative impact, then you can already see how difficult it is, you know, to assess any legitimate request from ESCOM. The third thing is I'm going to quickly mention what various speakers have indicated in their presentations, and I thank the two colleagues, colleague Jube and Conradi, for the details that they've provided. And however, I should say that in the case of the presentation by Mr. Jube, it would have been very useful not to use an example of a 10% variance in the sales decrease, but to actually take year 1, where you've got the 8 billion shortfall, and say, well, within that year, this is how and what the impact has been and why we need the RCA, and not to give us a lesson in what is essentially arithmetic. And similarly, I feel it will be in the interest of all of us that when you go to year 5, the second year, we've got a 15 billion shortfall, to similarly do the calculation using your formula so that everybody can understand how is it, you know, that this situation can apply in 1 year, and then in the next year it's double the problem of from 8 to 15, and all we are expected to accept is the method of an arithmetic calculation. I feel that's really not fair to those who have asked the question. And then, of course, you may as well do it for the third year, where you've got a 20 billion shortfall. so that we can even understand how is it that you didn't see the problem rising from 8 billion to 15 billion to 20 billion, and expecting the public and the regulator to say, well, because you had a court case, therefore we couldn't present this information earlier. But you're not telling us how is it that you allowed a bad situation of 8 billion to grow to double the next year, and that the third year is almost 3 times what the previous baseline was. How do you expect us to take decisions? Mr. Joubert said that in whatever is done with the RCA, there's no punishment of consumers. I wish Mr. Joubert could explain to us then that if these undue amounts are being requested, who is it being requested from? How can one make a statement that there is no punishment to consumers? Please explain what you meant there. I also want to indicate that okay, there's going to be a second round of questions, so I will just pause there.
May you, there will be some questions, and part of the questions also from my side is just for guidance really on the some of the information that you presented to us, to the extent that there are certain gaps. So it is for the regulator then to point out those gaps and then ask for further details so that there's a complete set of information that is presented before us. So we'll take that opportunity on the second round. If you could kindly just respond to the questions posed by my 2 colleagues.
Chairperson, thanks, and I'll ask my colleagues to come up because they'll deal with some of the questions. I think the first one, in terms of our auditors, it's Sizwe and Saluba Gabodo, and they've also got some other partners as part of our auditors, but they're the lead auditors. They've been the auditors now for Eskom, I think, for 4 years. And in terms of, and if you allow me, Chairperson, I think I can start with Mr. Adams' questions first. I think in terms of providing information and answers, I think during the course of this, yes, there's certain questions we have not yet responded to, and we'll close out during the Gauteng hearings, but on certain information and questions we have responded in writing, and maybe, Chairperson, I'm not sure if you'll have an opportunity to review that, but we have responded to a number of questions. I'm not saying it's all the questions, and maybe it's just that you haven't had the chance. But I think the second one, and then we are committed to, and we agree with Mr. Adam, it is the list and make sure that we've completed everything. I think just the question of the practicalities of the list of questions and then dealing with it in subsequent presentations. Yes, I think we definitely want to close out the big themes where we present them, but like we did here today, we focused on one of the themes or one of the areas we presented, but I think it's important for the audience to also see the bigger picture. But I think between Nersa and ourselves, we must work at a way of how we close the loop so everyone can see what's been responded to and what hasn't. I think the other question from Mr. Adam around affordability, yes, you are correct. Yes, we have to take that into account, and we spoke about the phasing and how it will impact on Eskom. But as part of the Electricity Regulation Act and the methodology, that's the tough balancing act that the regulator has to do. You need to protect the consumer, but you need to ensure that the utility is sustainable as well. I think, Chairperson, if you look at, and you can go into the reasons, but you have to get that balance. If you go too far on the one side, you're going to protect the consumer and the utility is not going to be sustainable. And as we know, Eskom does supply about 95% of the electricity in this country. Now, getting that balance right is a tough decision that the regulator must make. But you can't only go on the one side. because it's going to be to the detriment of the sustainability of the utility, and I think that's the balance that the regulator has made. I think you've seen in our financial results, you've seen the challenges we do have on going concern, the rating downgrades, and the outlook. Even Fitch just about a week ago that says the importance of this decision will go a long way to giving them confidence that, one, the regulatory mechanism is working, number two, it's predictable and it can be relied upon, and more importantly, it will give the signal that Eskom can meet its cost and debt commitments going forward. So I think we can't only talk affordability, it must be that balance between the utilities sustainability as well as affordability. It's not an easy decision.
All right, Mr. Kasim, on that question, there are two things that are missing that also Mr. Adams says that we haven't heard Eskom, and I would like you to note it so that you are able to respond in Gauteng and also in writing. One of the questions when it comes to the affordability is really a recognition on the impact of the increase of the cost that is asked by Eskom from the consumers. It is very easy for you to demonstrate from your viewpoint how Eskom will be affected, but your application does not go a long way to recognize the impact of this increase on the economy as well as consumers. I'll tell you why this is also important. You have on your own admitted in terms of the revenue shortfall that part of it is also customers, the lower reliance on Eskom and switching to other sources. So that's why then there's a shortfall as well, because your sales volume reduced because of the high prices, and that's what was mentioned this morning. So having that as well, what do you do as the utility? Can you please take that question and respond to it, because that's exactly what is needed on the question by Mr. Adam. If you could take it as part of the questions to respond to. Just hold on before you go ahead. Mr. Mkize has something to add on this specific issue.
Yes, thanks, Chair. Just on this specific issue, I think also Eskom, if you look at your last line of the presentation where you say that you are aware that the LCA balance will not be adequate once off and liquidated, once off, and therefore it's likely to be faced. I think that is also an area that presents an opportunity. In fact, we've spoken about this thing even last time to say it's not a question of you being aware, it's a question of you proposing it. Yes. And then be able to talk to, because that phasing in should talk to the issues of affordability.
Yes.
Noting that the people that are at the lower levels of income, they are not having even the opportunity of switching to other sources like big companies sometimes would. Please.
Yes. Yes. Chairperson will definitely do that.
Can I add the question, because really this is just to assist so that you respond there. May you also, given this increase, as you have already seen in all these years, that because also of the price component, customers are switching away from the grid. Now, can you then also, because part of the applications by utility, you also have to make sure that in your applications you make certain undertakings on efficiency improvement and certain commitments on how are you going to turn the situation around. That is always important when you make these kind of applications. Now, given this increase and having seen that customers are moving away and are taking less and the demand is declining, now with this increase, what are you going to do if you're going to see that situation of the demand decreasing due to the price? Can you tell us what are your plans when it comes to that? How are you going to deal with that situation? Are we not going to see the worst now? Because if this is not going to continue or perpetuated by the increase in prices, we also would like you so that it shows the forward looking also from Eskom, anticipating how the market is going to react to an increase in price. And that's really your core economic considerations that you need to present before the panel. Thank you.
Okay. Chairperson, and then I think the other item in terms of the numbers and in this illustration that Mr. Yobe showed, I'm sure for the closing counting, whether it's Soweto or Midrand, we'll update that as suggested by Mr. Adam, that we can then demonstrate it based on the actual numbers. And I think in terms of the ECS stuff, in terms of our detailed calculations as part of the information, this was a summary. We will then provide it to the members in terms of how we came up to that calculation of the ECS impact. I think from my side, just around the key information stuff, I'll let my colleagues come in and I can also come in. Do you have anything?
Chair, I'll start with a question about the water treatment cost. Yes, the water treatment cost can be a function of at least 4 drivers. The first one being that the price of chemicals could have changed from what it was estimated in mid-2012 when Eskom launched its application for the period up to March 2018. So it can change in those estimations might have changed, could be due to a function of the exchange rate or imported costs or anything. So the chemicals, that's the first one, the price of the chemicals can change. Second one is the volume of water that is processed through the water treatment plants could be higher or lower than anticipated in 2012 for the full 6-year forward estimated period. Water volume varies also with regard to electricity volume, but as an overall link to the total electricity volume, but the water volume can also increase or decrease due to a mix change between power stations. For instance, if production for whatever reason has to be moved from a dry cooled station to a wet cooled station, you will find an increase in water consumption because the dry cooled stations use a very low amount of water compared to the wet cooled stations. So there could be a water volume change due to a variety of reasons that can manifest over the 6-year forward period for which the estimations were made at the point of the application. And then lastly, the water treatment cost can change because of the quality of the water. Now the water quality is to a degree a function of rainfall and weather patterns. For instance, if there is a drought in a particular water catchment area and a particular power station cannot source water from that particular water source, they would have to obtain their water from another water source. Now if the other water source could differ dramatically in terms of the water quality. So the water quality from one source is not the same as the other source. So if a station predicted its water sources on the basis of normal weather patterns over the next 6 years, and it happens that there's higher rainfall or lower rainfall or whatever, it can force sourcing the water from a different water catchment scheme or water scheme, and that can immediately impact the cost of the chemicals because of the higher treatment that is required for the different water sources. So with regard to
Mr. Hubert, on that point, have we encountered that challenge with regards to the water treatment where alternative sources of water had to be considered?
Yes.
And I'm asking that question in respect to the periods under review.
That is, well, in every year's application document that we gave, there was a separate application document per year for each of the years of the RCA, and in each of those years there was a write-up on the drivers of the water cost and the water cost variances pertaining to that particular year. I can't offhand recall the level of detail for each year and which years, but as a general statement, we know we've been through periods of drought. These are things that regularly occur. I cannot stand here and say how it occurred. I would refer back to the application documents, and if that is insufficient level of detail, we can obviously supplement that with additional detail. Then with regard to the I'm not sure if it was a statement or a question, that had with regard to the load shedding, and had demand been higher from consumers, it would not have been able to be met. I think on Friday in Bloemfontein, Mr. Deva Govender and Mr. Gerry Bronkhorst explained that even in hindsight, if we look back now, there's not much that we can find that we could have done differently at the time. They explained the root cause of this, of the lack of capacity from the existing plant, and they explained the root cause of the commissioning dates on the newer units being later than predicted. In summary, the root cause of the technical condition of the existing plant can be traced back to the period commencing in 2004, when the existing power stations had to be run well above their design parameters. The example he used, it was being run with a rev counter in the red zone continually from 2008 right up to 2015. And part of the mechanism of squeezing more power out of the stations, was to postpone and defer certain parts of the maintenance. So even if the reduced electricity availability factor was a contributing factor to not being able to meet the demand, it still links back to what we said on the slide, that is merely an estimation error. So it means that if we in 2012 could foresee how the years of very hard running of the power plant would start manifesting in reduced energy availability from the power stations, it would have been forecasted at that point. It would have been forecasted that what the limit of supply would be, and on that lower demand level, the fixed cost absorption would have been calculated. So it remains, even if that is the reason, it remains an estimation reason and not a matter of prudency and efficiency. They explained on Friday how the situation that was forced on Eskom to step in and keep the lights on in the context of a build program that started 8 years late, how that resulted also in the deteriorating plant performance. With regard to the example of our volume change.
Can I just follow up on that question? Sir, you indicate that the delay in the capex because of the lateness in the new asset coming on board would have impacted on plant performance. Now, can you follow through? Can you follow through by indicating how does that lead to any factor in the RCA, right, being exposed to that risk situation? And secondly, what is the impact of that on the consumer? And the reason I'm asking that, Chairperson, is because I want to understand this as a practical example where Eskom says that it does not use the delay in capex to influence, and that consumers are not paying for that delay in capex. Can you please follow through in that way?
Did you understand the question?
Well, I'm not 100% sure. Maybe I should try and you can say if I'm...
I will repeat the question. You made the statement that there has been a delay in your capex in terms of the new plants, and that had an impact on the existing plants.
Yes.
All right. So obviously, by that I would understand that there would be cost implications, that your existing plants would have higher costs. Is that correct?
Well, they were running much harder than they anticipated to run.
Okay, so
the caused deterioration of the technical situation.
All right. That impacts on cost, does it? And those costs, then I want to understand, are those higher costs provided for in the RCA? And if it is provided for, the logical sequence is that consumers are being asked to cover that cost. And if that is the case, it means then that your capex, new capex, delays in it, in the end the consumer is paying for it. Maybe you must refute what I'm saying.
Yes, Chair, I'll understand the question.
Yes, there are two aspects. It means it's in the application just how you account for the delays. I think that's the first part, and the second part will be around on the sales volumes reduction as to from the supply constraints, the ability of ESCOM to then supply, given the fact that the plants were hard run, and then at some point the issue of unavailability of the plant, and due to the the plant performance of the deterioration of the plant.
Yes.
If you can just state those two aspects.
Yeah, I think that is a core question. And that is what we attempted to do on Friday, is to explain the root cause. But to respond again, yes, there were two main consequences, as was said on Friday and said this morning and said by Mr. Mo in Elspruit on Monday. The energy white paper of 1998 required the new baseload construction program to commence in 1999, and with the first new baseload power station up and running by 2007, because the energy white paper said by 2007 the capacity, the demand of the consumers will exceed the capacity. However, the plan that independent power producers would be constructing that new capacity did not materialize. So by the end of 2004, ESCOM was given the job back. ESCOM started from a position where it operated under the previous policy that it will never again build a power station in South Africa. So as Mr. Bronkhorst explained on Friday, ESCOM then responded by recalling all its engineers from all over Africa, where ESCOM had posted them to expand in the rest of Africa, given the government policy that ESCOM will never again build a power station in South Africa. So in a very rapid way, ESCOM had to recall those engineers. ESCOM recalled them from all over the business, also domestically, in order to form a new, from scratch, mega project management capability. And in 24 months, which as he indicated was way too short, the international norm is 48 months for project planning of that sort of a mega project. But because of the delay already up to that point, ESCOM was told you don't have 48 months. So in 24 months, ESCOM was at the point of issuing tenders. Although, as Mr. Bronkhorst explained, the tenders initially for Medupi was not based on the Medupi design. They were not ready yet. They couldn't be done in 24 months. So it was based on Majuba power station designs. There is a 4,000 megawatt power station of different technology compared to Medupi that is 4,800 megawatts and supercritical technology. Now that was the position ESCOM was in when it launched the project, and it was compelled to be in that position because there was imminent load shedding, and it was already experienced in January 2008. So ESCOM was told you don't have the 48 months that would be prudent and there's no norm internationally. Now, on that basis, the projects were started. As Mr. Bronkhorst said, from day one, it was, in fact, he said the probability was zero that it would be able, those units to be commissioned in 54 months, as was the world best practice that was being achieved in China at that point, with China having built 120,000 megawatts of coal. So the issue is, if you now look at the actual commissioning dates, they were later than the optimistic forecasts. However, in the context and circumstances, which is how prudence is assessed, prudence is always assessed in the context and circumstances that prevailed. And in the context and circumstances that prevailed at the time, as Mr. Bronkhorst explained, this was prudent and efficient outcome. This was the best outcome that you could get in that context and circumstance.
Yeah, but I think there's just a fundamental issue that you must attend to, not necessarily now, but in all your responses. I think it should be clear that the consumer must not be made to pay for the inefficiencies by ESCOM. That is what is actually official here. That whatever you say, whatever the costs are, then it should be clear that these costs have been prudently and efficiently incurred, if one can put it like that.
ISCOM fully agrees with that, Chair. ISCOM fully agrees with the notion that prudence and efficiency is applicable, and that prudence and efficiency is assessed in the context and circumstances that prevailed at the time. That was the context that ISCOM was operating in. ISCOM was told to get going after having been told for 8 years you will never again build a power station. It was under huge pressure to shortcut the process. The outcome of Medupi and Kusile, given the context and circumstance, is prudent and efficient, because you have to measure it in that context and circumstance. You can't ignore that was the context and the circumstance in which those projects were done. So the fact that they took 2 years longer to get to the first unit, or whatever the period was, cannot be evaluated in isolation of the context and circumstance that prevailed. So with that situation, in the meantime, the existing plant had to be run, as Mr. Governor explained, with the needle of the rev counter in the red zone permanently, and that started manifesting from end of 2012 in unreliability. Those were consequences of a situation that ISCOM found itself in that was not of its own making. So that was the context and circumstance. It was government policy that ISCOM keep the lights on in that period.
Mr. Hubert, just so that we make sure that we go to save time on this one. And I would like ESCOM on the slides that were presented by Mr. Governor and your colleague, that those slides again, they must be put up, because you'll recall that there were certain follow-up questions that could not be answered. Yes. And also from and you can see that again, the regulator members keep on asking questions on that. So part of the questions that were asked, really they go to the issue of the decisions that were taken by ESCOM at the time. And then the issue of accountability linked to such decision. Well, it's not a question of the regulator members here, because they cannot take any decisions. It's just a question of, it's an opportunity for ESCOM to clarify those decisions that were taken. How do you want the regulator to take those decisions into consideration? So that part on the decisions that were taken, delays on the investment decisions that ought to have been taken, the issue of the shareholder, which is government in this case, that said the lights must be on, the initiative, and all of those things that needed to be taken into consideration, including the use of the EPC. Remember, this was the question that was asked again by Mr. Mutise, which has not been answered. Yes, there was a slide that was presented by your colleague, Mr. Bronkhorst. Was one of your colleagues? Yes, I think it was. So all of those things, some of them have not been responded to. To a certain extent, on the investment decisions, yes, the answer is that yes, this was the problem and we couldn't invest. But the question is, how do we take that into consideration? Should that be seen as an efficient or a prudent decision by ESCOM? So all that we need is just a demonstration of that fact. So can I suggest therefore that can ESCOM spend time in its presentation, provide some of those details, including the additional questions that were asked by the regulator members? Then that can be presented also in Gauteng. I think it will assist in the process going forward.
So Chair, then I'll move on to the next question, and that is the example of how the regulatory methodology and the RCA mechanism deals with volume change, and that the purpose of that volume change adjustment is nothing else than to recover under-recovered fixed cost, or to pay back over-recovered fixed cost. Yes, I fully agree with Mr. Adams' suggestion it is actually what is set out in our RCA application documents, because that is exactly what the formula of the RCA does, is it calculates the volume difference, the revenue difference, and it calculates the variable cost difference, and it sets off the two against one another, and that is exactly how it sets out. So it's done already, and we can merely make a slide of it and throw it up. It's done, it's in our RCA application documents, which Nersa has been receiving over the last 3 years. And then the point about the punishment of consumers, that statement is in the context of a number of presenters over the last 3 weeks that have said Eskom's estimation error of demand that it made with the assistance of consumers in 2012 and with the concurrence of Nersa, there were a number of commentators or presenters over the last 3 weeks that said, yes, but in hindsight, that mid-2012 demand forecast up to March 2018, the 6 years up to March 2018, turned out wrong, and by turning out wrong, it's now causing additional cost to consumers, and it's not fair that consumers be punished in that way. Now, that comment is made in that context. So this, the example that we showed now this morning is to illustrate that after the mechanism, the RCA mechanism, has responded and adjusted for the volume change, what it does is it retrospectively corrects the revenue and the fixed cost recovery back to what it would have been in that initial year had there not been a volume estimation error. So the comment is made in the sense that this revenue is what would have been awarded and in that year, and it would have required a higher price, and had the estimations been accurate, it would have meant that consumers in those years would have had to pay a higher price already. And now it has deferred that part of that revenue, and that revenue adjustment is now made retrospectively to bring it back to that. And it is in that context. And we fully understand that consumers will say, but it's not affordable or whatever. However, in the end, if the costs are proven to be prudent and efficient in the context and circumstances in which the utility operates, then the matter is, well, who pays? So if it's not the consumer paying, then ultimately there is only one other source, and it is the South African taxpayer paying. But numerous economic impact studies commissioned by Eskom since 2009 by independent professional consulting economists have actually shown that the economic impact on the entire country, on the economy, on job creation and employment is worse if the model is followed to not recover the prudent and efficient cost through the price of the electricity, but to rather recover it by raising taxes. So in that context, it is a better economic outcome, also for employment and job creation, even for inflation rates, to recover prudent and efficient cost through the price rather than through increasing VAT rate or personal income tax or company income tax. Now, having said that, we're fully sensitive to the plight of indigent and other consumers, certain vulnerable industries, and for that reason, the electricity pricing policy allows cross subsidies to happen, and with certain criteria and requirements such as being transparent and so on. And some of these cross subsidies that would be required would not be Eskom's decision either. It is decisions made at national policy levels, Minister of Finance and so on, or National Treasury, etc. But it's for that reason and in recognition, not being insensitive to indigent and other and vulnerable industries and so on, that to a degree cross subsidies are allowed to reduce the impact on those categories. But the more you get the other customers who can afford to pay the proper price, the more it enables Eskom to subsidize the vulnerable sectors of the consumer body. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, so I just want to respond to the green line, slide on the green line, so I just want to get back there. Chair, and I think that all links together. If you look at this slide, what we say is there was a forecast volumes and all of that. Even before MIPD3, and that's why in the MIPD3 methodology, there was an understanding that it will be a shortfall, a probable shortfall. Didn't say there's going to be, there's a possibility of a shortfall going to happen during the period that Eskom will not be able to address. So what has happened here is, it is to address cases to actually prevent, because remember, everybody has said those times, all the studies have shown that if you have load shedding, the economic impact is much worse on everybody else. So the purpose of that stage was to, as Mr. Governor said, is to prevent load shedding as far as possible by cheaper means. Now, what has happened here is we said, okay, let's ask the customers, because they were part of the group that developed this, that we see how we can achieve the savings. So when we talk about the zero line there, if you look at the zero line there, that, and maybe we can do that for the Gauteng one, that is actually, and remember it's 131 individual customers, so this is a rough example of a customer. So that zero line there is then what we've negotiated with them of what was their baseline from where the savings will be determined. Because if you don't have a reference line, how do you determine savings? So that was the reference line in terms of you can save because that will help us not to load shed. Then we said, and I want to correct myself, I said it's Nersa that determines the percentage savings. It is not. It is the suggestion was it's the Minister of Energy. At that stage it determined 10%. So that 10% we said, okay, that's what we want to achieve. Now the idea of the ECS was, if they do not achieve that, they will pay a penalty. And if they save more than that, there will be incentive. But that was for the mandatory scheme. And the mandatory scheme never got off the ground. So for the voluntary scheme, what we said is, how can we then benefit them? Customers on that. And we said, the benefit that they will see is, we've calculated now whatever each individual of 131 customers, what was the savings that they contributed compared to their original baseline, compared to the zero. And then we've added all of those for that customer over the 3 years. And that's how we got to that savings amount. Because as I said, beyond 10% was not requested and there were other issues around it. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah, the green line is taking everything into account. Yeah, that's right.
So yes, Chair, to Mr. Mkizi's question, in our calculation of the savings, everything in the green line and up to the red line is included in there. And as we said, we will send the detailed calculations to the Nersa officials to look at.
I think for me it's a question of being able to clearly indicate that, and that the sales already discounted this portion that is, that was taken to as going to be a shortfall in the event.
I guess what is missing really, as the question was put, firstly in Durban when this question came up, it is how Eskom demonstrates, how you take that into consideration on the revenue that you have. So that's what Mr. Mkizi said.
And Chair, I think when this question was asked, in the RCA variance that we have now in the 44, this calculation of ECS is not taken into account. We did the calculation, then yes, in the conclusion we must say, as you're asking the other things, how would it be then taken into account?
So we want to then, in Gauteng on these things, please make sure that this is what you have done in terms of the approach that you proposed, that you calculated, the proposed calculation approach, and this is the kind of adjustment that you make. Can you please do it like that?
And then Chair, if I may, just on the international purchases, and is that the gross? Yes, that's the gross, because on the revenue side, the gross revenue is taken into account. But I think maybe on that one too, we'll send you in writing, because some of it is contractual, and you can see the impact, how it's taking, similar to how we do the revenue on the variable and the fixed. You look at the total on the internationals, both the revenue and the cost, and how it then falls back into the RCA. We can provide that. Thanks.
Just the last one, there was one question more that was said, Mr. Adam asked, how did this all develop and it just became bigger and bigger, and what did we do about it? I think it's important to understand, once the decision has been taken, and I think we've answered that as well earlier on, but maybe in the context is important. The decision has been taken. Then Eskom has suggested, because we see it was busy developing, so Eskom has proposed to Nersa that we use the actual values to determine the price increase for the following, the annual tariff price increase. But Nersa's ERTSA methodology that was halfway during the period was developed and approved does not allow for it to do anything about it. It said we have to use the decision numbers. So yes, it developed, but then we couldn't do anything about it because there was a fixed revenue and a sales decision.
No, but there's a question to that. You have seen it coming in all the years. It cannot be a question of you now finding yourself in this situation, and therefore the only other reaction from the licensee side is then to allow those increases to be factored in. What have you done in terms of ensuring that you can contain such cost? What are the kind of actions in terms of improving your own performance and efficiency levels to constrain the rising cost? That's the question.
Okay, and I think
so it cannot be answered in that manner. It's really about the licensee accounting for its own performance. Your efficiency considerations. Can we really take it like that? What were the efficiency considerations on the part of Eskom when you were faced with that situation? And remember, this is also part of the questions that were asked by stakeholders to say that the kind of situation that we see today with these applications that are before us is the increasing cost, yet the output is less. So that's the economic situation that we see, given the applications that are before us, but we're not getting Eskom's reaction to that, to say, when we are faced with this economic situation and on the business situation, what has been your reaction? How do you turn the situation around? Really, that's the essence of the question.
Thank you.
Can I then, at this point in time, just then, I'm not sure if members, they have the follow-up question, but we'll be very brief. And part of the questions, it will just be to request Eskom with further details. And I hope that with the ones that we've just clarified, straight to the point, that you've taken note of those. Mr. Mkisa.
Yes, thank you. I just want to check in terms of Eskom with the supply contracts that they have with the intensive energy users, if they have any powers emergency powers to shut down those plants in terms of demands, and also what is the Eskom's view that some of the stakeholders have claimed that Nersa does not have adequate information to make a rational decision at this juncture. What is Eskom's response to that? And then lastly, I think when it comes to the cost element, this is more of a comment to say that the first thing to check is if that cost element is allowable in terms of the framework or methodology. That is, look at prudency, efficiency, and reasonableness. Then we look at the issues of financial sustainability of Eskom, and then the socio-economic considerations. I think on your last slide, you mentioned that the sustainability of Eskom should be taken into consideration. And I think that it is incumbent upon you as Eskom to demonstrate that clearly for everyone, because that should be juxtaposed to the possible negative impact that is going to have on the economy, on the socio-economical aspects of the country. And that must also, there must be some kind of empathy to the consumer, not just a question of number crunching. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairperson. My two colleagues, in all the emphasis that they have placed, have really covered the additional areas I was going to mention. I'd like to make this point that there are too many glib statements and generic things which are being said, and yet the regulator is required to make decisions, you know, around those as responses. So in a sense, ESCOM is not giving us the information, the concrete details on which we are to make decisions. I think that is, you know, really an emphasis on what Mr. Modise said on Friday. Do not assume that because you've given us a response that you've actually addressed the question or given us legitimate facts on which to make decisions. So really what I have found missing in this whole process, and please excuse me for being frank, because we are going to have to deal with the whole question of inadequate information when we sit down with the decision making. There is no self-reflection on the part of ESCOM anywhere in the 9 or 10 presentations I've sat through. And if you don't do that, it means that we only have what you have said to go by and no new areas really on which to make a decision. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you, Mr. Adam. May we then take the opportunity, since we have this short time, just to make sure that at least we understand each other given today's presentation, just on the additional information. On the OPEX, we had requested information on the OPEX from a viewpoint of transparency but also accountability. We understand that today you only touched on the over expenditure, but we said because what we're interested in is efficiencies as a regulator. So we need to know from what we have allowed you to recover on the OPEX, how do you account for that? And remember, there were two aspects on the OPEX that we also said we would like to see how ESCOM operated efficiently when it comes to those two aspects. One is the maintenance. Second is the issue of personnel, and we take this also from the stakeholders that we're asking questions around personnel to see what is ESCOM doing. Really, it's then incumbent upon ESCOM to then demonstrate in terms of your efficiencies around the operational cost. So you then have to account for that and show also efficiency considerations around that. So that's the first one. Then the second question that was asked, it relates to the revenue shortfall. Really, if we're now going straight to the aspects of the application on the revenue shortfall, the part that that is a concern from stakeholders and from the members of the panel, which was not responded adequately to, is on ESCOM's ability to supply at the time. The fact that you are saying the demand decreased, the view is that from stakeholders is that even if that demand was that didn't decline, ESCOM would not have managed to fulfill and satisfy that demand due to the supply constraints on the part of ESCOM because of the plant availability. So how do you account for that? Why should that be? And it is something that consumers should account for. And further to that is the fact that ESCOM had to use electricity generated by third parties. So you had to fill the gap because you couldn't supply because of your own constraints, but then you had to buy from others, the IPPs, and also to use the OCGTs. How do you factor in that aspect in your application? Because you're not accounting for that. So that is the element that you need to address now in your presentation in Gauteng. Reflect on your own supply constraints and the ability to supply, given the fact that plant deteriorated, plant non-availability, and issues of load shedding, and further to that, the fact that the production from the cheaper cost plus coal mines, you couldn't produce from that. You had to switch to the most expensive. How do you account for that? Why should consumers pay for? So that is the aspect that is missing when you now give the factors that affected to the shortfall. So the shortfall cannot be claimed entirely and the risk is shifted to the consumer. How do you share the risk on your part out of the things that you couldn't do? This relates to the fact that when we approve the MYPD3, and which is the part that you always miss here, you only talk about we were allowed to to recover X. You are not saying that when you're allowed to recover X, there's performance standards assigned to it. So how do you account for that performance standard that was there? If it was 80% availability of the plant, you couldn't achieve that standard of 80%. How do you then account for that? So that is the part that is missing, and which we actually guided ESCOM. Can you please then fill in the gap all the time, thinking about the performance standard that was assumed, not the fact that then we couldn't do this, it was beyond our control, but talk about the performance standard, because we allowed these things based on that standard of performance. So you couldn't achieve the performance. How do you account for that? Then the other part that you need to relook at is the issue of the fixed cost, especially insofar as other plants were not available. What kind of adjustments would you make? Are you just standard and say, well, our fixed cost, we need to get so much, so for the 3-year period, but what about the plants that were not in service? Because then you need to recover cost for the plants that contributed in the provision of the regulated service. So just give account on that. I take into consideration the issue of usefulness or usable, but just account also just on the fact that did those plants contribute to the provision of the regulated service during the period under review? That is the question, if you can respond to that. Apart from the issues of usefulness and usable. The other thing that obviously you need to come back on and just demonstrate is the one on the ECS, just the adjustment on the ECS. Remember, it's just the issue of adjustment on the revenue. And then the second one that was not there, and stakeholders, most of the comments in writing on the oral submissions, is on the load shedding that you have not even touched on. I know that with regards to now your responses, you touched on the load shedding, and you, for the first time, you demonstrated even the calculation, how you calculated it. But in your application, it's not there. And you have not even shown, in terms of the revenue, how you have done the adjustment on the figure that you have come up with using your own calculation. So that's the part that is missing from ESCOM. I think the others were covered, or the other one is just the economic considerations insofar as the impact of the increase is concerned, number one. And number two is the efficiency driven strategies that ESCOM has to place or submit to the regulator, and also touch on your efficiency-driven strategies, given the fact that any further increase could actually result, as you have seen in all these years of the MYPD, that people are now switching away. They're not buying the amounts that they used to buy, and there's a decline in demand. So what do you do with that situation? Is these increases that are requested here, or the adjustments that are requested here, not going to compound that situation? And therefore, what do you do? Because that's the economic effect that we need to make an assessment of, which is then missing in the application. So we need the response from ESCOM in that regard. Then the last issue is the implementation, the proposed implementation that you need to submit to the energy regulator. But I think just because we didn't have much time, because I didn't, so I prefer to just guide to say what are the things that we need. On the issue of the demand estimation error, I think that statement then is not taking into account the things that I've stated now, where you have a reflection on your own performance, and the standards that were set. You're simply saying that blaming everything on demand estimation, that the estimation was inaccurate. It is nothing of ESCOM, because even the decisions that you said were taken by the shareholder, by government. It's like all of those, it's not part of what caused the situation that you find yourself in. You're simply saying that no, everything must be blamed on demand estimation inaccuracies. and it's not linked up. So that statement cannot be correct. So we'd like you to reconcile that statement, your perspective, your view, with all of these other things that happen. So it cannot be right that everything else you seem to say, no, this is not the case. That one we did it because government said we must do this. Or the issue of plant performance. No, yes, there was a plant bad performance, but if we didn't do this, we were not going to have the bad performance on the plant. That the fact of the matter, the plant did not perform according to the standard. So what do we do with that? So it cannot be that, don't blame me for that, even if it didn't perform, don't blame ESCOM for that. That can't be. And then you say that it's only purely the issue of demand estimation error. So ESCOM, can you then take 2 minutes, just no, it's going to be at the end. But you've got all of those, Mr. Kassim. All right. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to then allow that we break for tea, and then we'll come back and take the next presentation from secretarial members. The tea break is going to take 15 minutes, and we'll be back here after 15 minutes. Thank you.
His Royal Majesty.
It's